Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. We have the privilege of studying Parashat Shemot. I don't remember if I shared this last week. Every week I say, "Oh, we have a very unique parsha." Last week was unique because we had the brachot of Klal Yisrael, of the Jewish people, um, and this week it's unique because it's a beautiful parsha. It happens to also be my Bar Mitzvah parsha, so that's always fun, accidentally. But did I share that story last week? All right, good. Um, in keeping with our new scheme for this learning for our group, um, I've been trying to think about like how we make sure we really want to engage the text and pick up on some of the details and sort of uncover underneath the rock, like the really, there's so many layers of debate. And so in this week's Torah portion, I figured we would get a little bit in, and then I didn't get so far. Um, so we'll dive in. What I want to look at is sort of the beginning part of slavery. I think so often we talk about, Moshe. There are so many narratives that follow through the parsha, and often we amplify different ones. And how do I know that there's so many narratives? So for those of you who remember the Haftorah debates, right? There's actually Parshat Shemot is one of the parshiot that have two Haftorahs, one read by the Ashkenazi community, one read by Sephardic communities and other communities. Why? Where is this divergence? And it's not like some of the other Haftorot where you start at one point and you end at a different point, or you end at a different point. These are two totally different Haftorot. One is the Haftorah that we read, the christening of Yirmiyahu, and the other is from Yeshayahu about the Jewish people, right?
Maybe christening is not really the right word to use here.
I like it too much, and there's no good alternative. Um, so the investiture, the inauguration of Yirmiyahu. Why? Where does this come from? So it happens to be that there are two storylines that pulse through our parsha. One is the storyline of the Jewish people, the slavery, the challenge, and there's a big debate about these things. What type of slavery? What's the quality of the slavery? Right? Is everyone enslaved? Is Shevet Levi? Is the Levites not enslaved? What's the slavery look like? Is it slavery to the state? Is it slavery to individuals? Is it progressive tax? Like if you're a rich Jew, you didn't have to be a slave, but if you're a poor Jew, you couldn't buy your way out. Like there's a ton of debates around that, right? And what's the quality of Jewish identity and Jewish life in Egypt? Is it booming? Is it not? Right? Are the Jews, on the precipice of hell, the 49th level of Tumah? Or are they strong, stick to their guns with their language and their dress? And, these are all midrashim that tie up those different pieces. And that's the through line of the narrative of the Jewish people. And that's actually reflects our Haftorah. And when I say our, I mean Ashkenazim. The Ashkenazic Haftorah reflects sort of about the communal experience, the communal slavery, the communal strive for freedom, the communal hope for redemption, the communal side of it. But there's another narrative that comes through. We're introduced to Moshe, the leader of the Jewish people, the savior of the Jewish people, the quintessential partner with God, who will bring down the Luchot, will be the author of the definitive word of God. Even though we have all of Tanakh, obviously the Torah, the five books of Moshe, has a higher component, a higher standard, a higher stature, is invested with greater significance and religious and legal authority. We are introduced to Moshe's origin story. Right? That's another through line that goes through this parsha, and you can almost read the parsha. Lahavdil, excuse my analogy, right? I love Lord of the Rings, right? I like the books, I like the movies. They always come up around my birthday. My wife is an Eishes Chayil, and she used to go see them with me, even though she hates the movies. But they always came out in December, and she couldn't avoid it. But one of the cool things about the movies, for those who, let's say, rewatch them, is that you can really follow the storyline, right? There's the and they shift. It's not like totally synchronous, but like you can almost fast forward, and if you want to follow the Frodo storyline, you can skim over the what's going on with Aragon and Legolas and this and that, or what's going on here, what's going on there. There are these multiple storylines that are unfolding that are sequenced in. That's our parsha, right? I imagine that to be the same sort of thematic narrative, dramatic presentation of our Parsha. We read about the Jewish people, then we segue into the birth of Moshe. We read a little about Moshe and his experience. He runs away, and then we read again that the Jewish people are they're groaning, they're caught under the burden of oppression and challenge, and then we read about Moshe some more, and then it sort of intertwines what's going on with the Jewish people, and they're upset. Right? There are all these sort of in and out sagas, these two storylines, the plot A about the Jewish people, plot B about Moshe. And we learn a ton about Moshe through this. And so which plot line should be reflected in the Haftorah? Should it be about the development of the leader, Moshe, i.e. what the Sephardim choose for Haftorah? Or should it be about the Jewish people, the slavery, the hope for redemption, which is what our Haftorah is about? So those through lines overlap. And often we sort of, I think, focus more on the Moshe story. So I wanted to just talk about the beginning part, and let's just read through the beginning of the Parsha, and we'll come to one or two points, and we'll see some massive debates around some of these pieces. Ve'ela Shemot b'nei Yisrael habayim Mitzrayim et Yaakov ish uveito bo. These are names of the Jewish people that came to Egypt, that ascended to Egypt with Yaakov. Ish ubeitovo, they both came, right? And if you recall in the past, we've talked about, is it Yisrael? Is it Yaakov? Here you have a verse where both of them are being used. One's representing the Jewish people, Yisrael, and then we have the person, Yaakov, and his family who came down. Again, this is a beautiful way of seeing the different uses of that. We read about the tribes. Verse 5, Vayhi kol nefesh, yotzei yerech Yaakov shem nafesh. All the people issued from Jacob's line are 70, and Joseph is in Egypt. Vayamat Yosef v'chol achav v'chol dorhu. Joseph dies, all his brothers die, everyone dies. Bnei Yisrael, Peru, Vayishutzu, Vayiru, Matzmum, B'mom, Ovetz, Maratosam. And the Jewish people were fertile and multiplied, and they increased, and they filled the land. Vayakam Melech Chadash al Mitzrayim. A new king comes to Egypt, Asher lo Yadai Yosef, that did not know Joseph. What does this mean? This is what I want to spend some of our time today. Like what does this mean practically?
Whatever privileges, rank, and whatever ability to command Yosef had, it's now up in the air until Yosef and the new Paro can either come to some sort of new agreements or...
Yosef's dead. Yosef's long dead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so Paro did not know the favors that had been bestowed by Yosef upon Bnei Israel.
And by the way, and not just upon Bnei Israel, upon the Egyptian people. Right? This sets the frame for the slavery. Vayomer Alamo, he said to his nation, Hine Abnei Israel, Rav Yatsumimenu. These Jews, they're all over the place and they're numerous. Hava Nitchak Malo, let's deceive them and let's enslave them, because if not, they're going to kick us out, right? They're going to take us over. Jews will not replace us. Part of why I look at this is because this is the root. And this is going to be flagged on YouTube now, right? I said Jews will not replace us, and now it's going to be flagged as anti-Semitic. But part of what I want to look at is this documents one of the first examples of national ethnic anti-Semitism or royal anti-Semitism, political anti-Semitism. That we see cast at the Jewish people. And it's interesting to see how the commentaries understand this through the lens of understanding the depths of anti-Semitism, right? That's sort of the big picture of what we're looking at. So what happens? The new Joseph carries favor. And for those who are in Shul last Shabbat, right, that was sort of the point of my sermon. For those who weren't, part of the idea was the message of Bereshit is that without intervening of the divine, of God, of faith, of religion, of law, humans left to their own devices will not work out well. It is bad news for the Jews. And so that seems to be part of this notion. And that's what we see right over here. Joseph, who in Egypt gets royal treatment in last week's Torah portion, he and his people are long forgotten, and they get enslaved. right? Um, uh, right. So what does this mean? Vayako Melech Hadash HaMitzrayim Shelo Yidai Yosef. So let's just start with Rashi, right? Rashi is the base where we always start with, and Rashi quotes the Gemara. The Gemara is quoted in two places. Rav and Shmuel. Shmuel and Rav have a debate. Who is Shmuel and Rav? Who is Shmuel and Rav? They are early Amoraim. Rav maybe even be like a Tana, but they're right on the cutoff between the Mishnaic time and the Talmudic time. And we don't know who says what, right? This is a very classic, sometimes Talmud. One said one says the other. Chad Amar, one said, Chadash Mamish. Totally new. This is a new king. The old king died. Long live the king. New king is there who didn't know Yosef. We have to understand, what does that mean? He didn't know Yosef. Even if he's a new king, what, he never learned Egyptian history? They didn't realize these people have made them a superpower? But Chad Amar, Nitchadshu Gezerotav. His decrees became new, meaning he started acting differently. He was not the same person he was yesterday. It's not new, it is different. Asher lo yada Yosef, that doesn't know Yosef, says Rashi, quoting again the Gemara, Asa atzmo kilo lo yadao. He made himself as if he didn't know. It doesn't matter if he was really new or he made himself new. Either way, he should have known about Yosef, but he chose to forget that. He chose to ignore that. Says Rashi, this is sort of a malicious attempt uh, at rewriting history to harm the Jewish people.
So
Sort of
the take is that he is not necessarily, he could be, but he's not necessarily a different person. That there could be political ramifications or personality disorder or something changed is what you're saying.
something changed. And let's contrast that with other people. So, for example, the Ibn Ezra is very attuned to the fact that this language seems to be a different language, right? It doesn't say Vayamat Melech Mitzrayim. It doesn't say the king died. It said Vayakam Melech Hadash, a new king died. What happens to the old king? Right? So says the Ibn Ezra, Shelo Haya Mizera Melucha. There was a new king that came to town, a new dynasty. Vayaka means the old king was deposed. There is a new dynasty, this is a dynamic change, a dynastic change, excuse me, a dynastic change. It's not just a new king, right? But this is a totally new ruling family that came in, and therefore it makes sense they don't know Joseph. They don't know the history. This is a warring faction. Ki kimo, hikim, whatever, he quotes it from another verse. That seems the case. And this, the Shadal, who is, for those who are familiar with Shadal, we quote them sometimes. Rav Shmuel Zato, who lives in the 1800s. He dies in I think 1870, 1875, I think, or 1865, around that time, end of the 1800s. And he's very enraged and enthralled by the explosion of knowledge in the secular world. History, ancient history, like what they know. And he makes the claim that he knows that this fits in with the epi lists. Those are the lists of the kings that are serving in Egypt. That this makes sense that there are different, for those who study ancient Egypt, we know there are different dynasties. There's the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, the new kingdom, the old Egypt. And there are different dynasties that take. This is a new dynasty that comes up. They don't know anything about Yosef, and that's what's going on. What happened here? Political change. Josephus, who is one of the earliest commentaries written at the end of the Second Temple, writes, and in his introduction to this section, he writes, I'm reading it in I guess I have a translation of it here. In having in the length of time forgotten the benefits that they received from Joseph, particularly the crown being now come into from another family. Meaning, what happened over here? Political change, total political disruption. They just didn't know about. It's I guess the least malice way of seeing what happened, right? And by the way, points out some of these commentaries, it doesn't say Vayamat, right? It doesn't say they died, right? Now, someone who will argue with this will say, didn't we just read in verse number 6, Vayamat Yosef v'chol achav v'chol adorahu, that Joseph died, his brothers died, and everyone died? So that would mean the king also, right? So others aren't as convinced about this difference. But it doesn't say, as it does in other places, right? Vayimloch tachtav, vayamos, vayimloch tachtav, that he died and he ruled after him, right? That formulation is missing, and that's what's going on here. New king, they really don't know Joseph, and everything that happens now is sort of a fear of the foreign. Not like Rashi, right? Rashi, we already know, is taking out of the opposite opinion. Whether this was a new king or whether this was a king that just changed his stripes, the important part is Asa Oto. He made himself as if he didn't know Joseph. He should have known Joseph, right? Much more malicious. Suggest Rav Yosef Ibn Kaspi, who is also a very important commentary. The Ibn Kaspi, he lives 1280 to 1340 in Provence. He's a rationalist, heavily influenced by the Rambam, by Maimonides. He actually wrote a commentary on Maimonides, Mor Nevuchim, on the Guide to Perplexed. Yeah.
That was about the time, and also was in Provence, where the whole concept is unrelated to the Parsha. The whole concept of Kitniot for Pesach came about. Was he one of those responsible? I mean, the timing and the location match.
I don't want to be Moti Shemer on someone that I know for sure. I don't know for sure, so I
Okay.
wouldn't want to cast aspersions on someone unless I was sure that he was responsible for it. I don't know. I don't know
Okay.
who are the people behind it. As we all are casual Kitniot haters. Anyways, what does he say? Chadash. What does he say? Chadash. What it means is it's just a new king, not a totally new dynasty. Sort of a middle ground. He says, Amar Ibn Ezra, quotes the Ibn Ezra, saying this is the Mizera Hamalucha, this is a new king. Va'ani Tama, I am very perplexed. Me'en lo elu hanivuot. Where did he get these prophecies? Right? These aren't facts. How does he know that? Ki milat vayakam gam chadash, eno morer al zaklau. The word Vayakam and the word Chadash don't mean that these were totally new dynasties. Lachein hu kipshuto. It should be the simple explanation. V'hatam, and the reason, sheba zeh hamelech achar zman himlich shahaya ahav et Yosef. This is just a new king, not the king that loved Joseph. Maybe not even the son of the king that loved Joseph. Zeu amar lo yada Yosef. Atam, and this is the reason. Hed yedia bestam im yediat ava. He lacked the knowledge, right? He lacked the knowledge. He didn't. It's not that he. It's not that he. There's a distance between him and Joseph, and that's what happens over here. The Ibn Kasbi disagrees with Ibn Ezra and says this Vayakam doesn't mean this is a totally new example. Melech Hadash just means it's a new king. Doesn't mean a new dynasty. Doesn't mean it's a new people. It doesn't mean anything like that.
I have a question. I'm sorry I came in late, so maybe you said this before. How many years has there been since Yosef lived? Did you say that before?
We didn't, but that's part of the Ibn Ezra follows this opinion as well. Not the Ibn Ezra, excuse me. The Abarbanel follows this opinion as well, and he suggests that there's a Masoretic break.
Yeah.
Right? If you look in your Chumash, there's a Masoretic break between verse 7 and verse 8. And that Masoretic break is because there's a lot of time between Vayamat Yosef dying, and when Yisrael Paru Vayishritzu, and the Jewish people growing, becoming more fruitful and multiplying, and Vayakam El Chadash. right? There's the gap there between those things. Joseph died, the Jewish people succeed, period, break, lots of time, maybe 210 years, maybe 100 years, a lot of time. A lot
Oh,
of time
yeah, yeah.
comes by. A lot of times comes by. At least according to him. And says the Abarbanel that had Paro known Yosef, maybe he would have acted this way. Right? It's a lack of knowledge, a lack of knowledge. Then comes the third school of thought, right? And that's what we alluded to already with Rashi, quoted based on the Gemara. And this is actually where it gets, it's all interesting, but this is where I think it gets a little bit more interesting. Because so far, what we've described is there's sort of a lack of knowledge, either because of a cataclysmic break, a dynastic change, which cut the institutional memory off, and that's why this happens. Or there's a time frame that changes, and that thing. Now, it's not good they treat the Jews that way, but it wasn't like this pernicious, malicious situation. They just didn't know. Lo Yada, they didn't know Yosef because they truly never heard of Yosef. This is a new dynasty. They didn't know the old dynasty. They burnt all the old records. Lo Yada, there was an incomplete knowledge, says Rav Sajagon, right? Rav Sajagon says they just didn't know. The Sforno suggests Lo Yada. What does that mean? The Sforno says definitely he knew the chronicles, the stories of the old kings. Biprat be'inyan chidush asher sam lachlok lo alta alev hamelech hachadash efsharut biot mizuam. He didn't know that this Joseph was connected to that nation. Right? Of course, he heard of Joseph, but he didn't know that Joseph was part of the Jewish people. He didn't know he was a Hebrew. Then you come to some of the other people, the people say, no, he really did know. He really did know him. He just didn't know him personally, right? That's the timing. But then you have these other ones. He didn't like him. Right? Yada can mean lots of things. Yada can mean sort of like a personal affection and intimacy. Or as we just quote, as we are about to quote, this third opinion, quoting Shmuel and Rav, quoting Rashi, quoting the Tanchuma, that he actually acted as if he didn't know Joseph. And this gives way to some of the conversation about what? God hardening Paro's heart, right? That Paro is clearly manipulating his own emotions already to bring that forward. And this is where we have the motivations, which are really interesting, right? What motivates? Let me reread the Gemara for you, which we started with. It's quoted by Rashi. You can look at it in Rashi, but let's just reread it. And then I want you to hear what's the motivation. I mean, not that we know, but what's the motivation? Rav Shmuel both said that nitchadesh gzerosav. He changed his decrees, right? He made his decree news. Lo yadat Yosef asa atzmo ki'ilu lo yadat Yosef. He made himself as if he didn't know Joseph, right? What's his motivation here? I'm not looking for to pass the Trump tax plan, right? I don't mean like we don't have that much detail, but it doesn't seem like there's an external force here, right? He decided to do something not nice. Maybe he was kafoi tov. He didn't want to show gratitude to him. Maybe he didn't like Joseph. Maybe it was personal. Maybe he thought he'd be a better king if he put together whatever it is, right? It seems like this is who's driving this, the political leadership, the king, right?
Yeah.
Let me read you the midrash now. And I think this is just a really fascinating, again, if we look at this as a lens to institutional anti-Semitism in society, how it looks. The Midrash, the Tanchuma, excuse me. So the Medrash Tanchuma says the following thing. Kevan Shira HaMitzrim. Hold on. The Tanchuma says the following thing. Where is it?
I'm gonna eat lunch.
Sorry about that. Oh, here it is. Amar of Abo, Amar of Kahana, V'chi melech chadash haya? Was this really the new king? Elo shechidesh alav gzeirot shel paraniot. No, it wasn't a new king. He forced upon them new decrees that were evil. What does that mean? Hu haya para rishon. This was the para rishon. Elo amru lo ba v'nizdog leumazu. Let's go and let's worry about this nation. The people, his Congress came to him. Amar lahem ad achshav hayu mishalam. You were supporting them. Anu mizayin lahem v'ilu Yosef lo haya laotam anashim yadayim. He never listened to them. They kept saying, don't trust these people. Don't trust Yosef. Don't give them power. Lo shama lahem. He didn't listen to them. He said, no, don't you remember Joseph? He saved us. Don't you remember how great these people are? They're part of us. They're part of our nation. Miyad horiduhu mikisa shalosh chadashim. They exiled him from his throne. They deposed him from his throne. The people, the masses, deposed him from his throne for 3 months. Kevan shera'a shahoridu amar lahem komash atem omrim ani shomeh lachem. Once he saw that he lost his political role after 3 months, he said, whatever you want, I will do. Lachein lefikach vayaka melech hadash. That's why it says a new king emerged. He doesn't say the old king died, because he didn't. But a new king emerged. His leadership style changed. His disposition to the people changed.
Well, given
The time. Sorry.
Given that that effectively the people threw him out, and he's decided to make a change in his political outlook and his policies, which were not good for the Jews. This would suggest that the anti-Semitism may have been prevalent or rampant in the people before any of this happened.
100%.
Otherwise, why would it start taking it out on the Jews?
100%. According to this model, Paro was the last domino to fall, but it was the people's national proposal and their hate of the Jewish people that led to the impetus for this anti-Semitism. Meaning it's not the kings. It wasn't top down. It was bottom up.
Bottom up.
Right? Which, by the way, answers certain questions like why did all the Egyptians get punished? Why is it fair that X or Y happened? Like all of these things, it depends where the locus of power is. Right? That's a really interesting perspective here. That it's not the leadership that ultimately brings but ultimately what brought about the anti-Semitism was the was the people and a push for the people. And Paro might have been a really big hero. He got deposed for the sake of the Jewish people. How much more do you think he should have risked himself for, right? But ultimately he comes down as the villain and he does terrible things, right? Along this line, and a third approach, we've talked about anti-Semitism as coming from the political elite and filtering down to society. We talk about anti-Semitism filtering up from the masses. One other perspective here is more of a divine, and they're not mutually exclusive. But one of the other perspectives here is actually the flip side, that this was part of God's plan. This is the same sort of heart manipulation that God will harden Paro's heart in the future, that God is upset about the Jewish people acclimating so much into the Egyptian society. And so this is a wake-up call to them. Now, many of the commentators actually argue very strongly against this, because that would really question like all the free will conversations that we have in this section. But that is part of this conversation. I'm pretty sure the Tanchuma actually ends with this.
Rabbi, may I ask a question?
Oh, 1 second. I want to just end with one piece. The Medrash then ties this back to one thing. And this is a very classical Midrashic approach and a fundamental sort of perspective on gratitude in general. Asher lo yadat Yosef, that did not know Joseph. Lo haya makir et Yosef, shenemar shelo haya Yosef. Did he not know Yosef? No. He changed his position on Yosef because of what happened. Kach paro asa. I'm sorry. Then he gives a mashal. Lama davar. What is this like? Le'echad, to one of the king's people, who, it's a little complicated metaphor, but we'll just give him the upshot of it. Kach paro. This is what Paro did. Achshav amar lo yadat Yosef. He didn't recognize what Joseph did for him, and he didn't have that gratitude. So what did that lead to? Lemachar, the next day, what does he say at the end of the book, the Parasha of Shemot? Lo yadati et Hashem. I don't even recognize God anymore. I mean, this is the paro that God had revealed and vaulted to international success because God had given him insight into God's plan. And now this paro is saying, I don't know who God is. So when you're kafui tov, when you are ingrateful, and you don't show gratitude, and you you change the way for the people who've always supported you, it goes back to a much more fundamental character flaw, and you'll turn even on God in that situation. And that's a very classic sort of approach to gratitude. We see the opposite of that when it comes to the Ten Commandments, to kaved et avicha, honoring your parents, right? Because gratitude for your parents is a microcosm of gratitude for God. All right, Steve, you had a question.
Regarding, you made a comment about Hashgacha Pratis a couple of minutes ago, to the extent that there is potential tension between the idea of God having orchestrated all of this because perhaps the Jews were too much assimilated, but that is a potential issue vis-a-vis free will. So, so my question is, maybe it's a statement, that I'm under the impression from some reading I've done that there are some important sages, even among those who take a pretty maximalist viewpoint of the extent of Hashgacha Pratis, that despite that man still has free will, even within the sort of the global viewpoint that Hashem controls everything, but that we still have free will.
But what's the question exactly?
I guess it wasn't a question. You had, I thought you had said a couple of minutes ago that that one of the viewpoints is that perhaps God had orchestrated all of this, the new Pharaoh and whatnot, to set the stage because the Jews had become too assimilated into Egyptian society, but that, if I understood you correctly, some people feel that is at odds with the idea of man having free will. So
yeah, I mean according to some ways of reading the Midrash, right? That the Paro is sort of manipulated on both fronts. His decrees are by divine design to sort of to punish the Jewish people for being too buddy in Egyptian society, and to stigmatize their assimilation. On the flip side, then they get punished for that command. So you have like Rasaja Gaon, who writes a lot about this, and his commentary on some of the verses in Tehillim, they're used as that example. Says absolutely not. That's not what happened here. And he even reinterprets some of the verses in Tehillim that are set to refer to this, to reject that can't be the case, that there needs to be free will. That's going to be a push and pull through all of these stories. Some commentaries are more comfortable with sort of suspension of free will. Some are less comfortable. Some will also say free will is more, there's also a whole debate, like, what does free will mean? Right? I'll give you one contemporary conversation about free will, right? There's a book called Nichtav Eliyahu, written by Rabbi Dessler from the last generation, and he claims that free will is a very narrow point, right? None of us get up in the morning and feel rageful enough to commit murder, right? We've been conditioned by society. We're sort of bound by things like we're not able to commit murder. I mean, technically, maybe we're strong enough to, but like none of us have the resources, the composure to be able to do that. Thank God, right? Thank God. No one on this call is a murderer, right? So does that mean we have free will not to commit murder? No, we're trained by that society, right? So where do we exercise free will? Where do we have free will? In the very narrow point, which he refers to as Nakuda Habachira, the decision point, where you're actually holding, like, am I going to be a great spouse today or not such a great spouse? Am I going to yell at my kids, not yell at my kids? Am I going to, make some extra time for, for learning to come to Minyan, or am I not? Am I going to, scroll on my computer all day, or am I going to do something productive, right? Those are free choice moments that we have. But like most of us aren't called to go have a cheeseburger today. Like I'm not making a conscious decision not to eat ham and cheese today, right? Just not part of my DNA anymore, ever, right? So that's he limits. So that's a really interesting conversation about like the nature of free will. Also, that doesn't undermine free will; it sort of just narrows it. But many of the commentators who are concerned about theologically limiting free will reject or change the way we understand the Medrash Tanchuma. But yes, Renata.
Yeah, I understand the whole conflict between free will and God's determination over the idea of God hardening Paro's heart later on. But in this particular instance, as I'm reading it, and maybe I'm reading it very simplistically, he says to his people, this is Paro speaking, behold, the people, the children of Israel, are more numerous and stronger than we. Come, let us outsmart it, lest it become numerous, and maybe that there'll be a war and these Jewish people will join the enemies. So it seems to me that he's showing free will here. It seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, he's showing logical, but I'm not sure if it's free will.
Well, okay. Yeah,
So
we don't
fair.
know that. Okay.
Yeah. All right. We're going to stop here. Different perspectives and things to consider as we move forward.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.
You too.